When World War II ended in 1945, the world was supposed to have drawn a clear line between good and evil. The Nazis were defeated, their crimes were exposed, their ideology was condemned. But behind closed doors, the victors were already deciding which parts of that evil they could use, and how much morality they were willing to trade for power. Operation Paperclip began as an American mission to secure technology and scientific knowledge before the Soviets could. But it became something darker, an ethical paradox wrapped in secrecy. The US government brought over more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had built the weapons of terror that fueled Hitler's war machine, and yet they would soon be working for the same nation that had once sworn to destroy everything they stood for. At the center of it all was one man, Wernher von Braun. A brilliant rocket engineer, von Braun had been the architect of the V-2 rocket, the vengeance weapon that rained destruction on London and Antwerp. Thousands of civilians were killed by his rockets, and thousands more, prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, died building them under horrific conditions in underground factories. Yet when the war ended, von Braun was not tried at Nuremberg. He was flown to America, given a new identity, and placed at the heart of the US space program. This was the moral contradiction of Operation Paperclip. The same hands that had built weapons for a genocidal regime were now building rockets for freedom, exploration, and the American dream. Officially, the program was meant to prevent Nazi technology from falling into Soviet hands. But unofficially, it was an arms race of the soul. Both superpowers, the US and the USSR, were scouring the ruins of the Third Reich for mines that could give them an edge. Stalin had his own version, known as Operation Osoaviakhim, seizing thousands of German specialists. The Cold War wasn't just born from ideology. It was born from the ashes of German science. In 1946, the US Army quietly established the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the secret branch that ran Paperclip. Their task: sanitize the backgrounds of former Nazis so they could be employed without public outrage. Files were rewritten, party memberships were omitted, war crime allegations were brushed aside. What mattered wasn't who these men had been, but what they could build. Von Braun wasn't the only one. Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen the V-2 production line using slave labor, became a key figure at NASA and helped develop the Saturn V rocket, the one that sent Apollo 11 to the moon. Hubertus Strughold, a Luftwaffe doctor linked to human experimentation, became known as the father of space medicine. Kurt Blohm, a Nazi bioweapons researcher, was later hired by the US Army to work on chemical warfare. These weren't isolated cases, they were the backbone of America's scientific leap forward. By the 1950s, their influence was everywhere. From missile technology and aerospace engineering to early computer science and medicine, the fingerprints of former Nazis were embedded in the fabric of American progress. Every rocket launched toward the stars carried with it a shadow from the past, a moral debt buried beneath layers of patriotic triumph. When President Truman first approved Paperclip, he explicitly forbade the recruitment of any Nazi or anyone more than a nominal participant in its crimes. But the CIA and military intelligence simply ignored it. They changed names, altered biographies, and created the illusion of purity. To them, it wasn't a question of ethics, it was national security. As the Cold War intensified, that justification only grew stronger. The Soviets had taken over Peenemünde, the heart of Germany's rocket research. They had their own German scientists building intercontinental missiles. In response, the US doubled down on Paperclip, integrating the Germans into secret projects at Fort Bliss, White Sands, and later NASA. When Sputnik launched in 1957, shocking the world, it wasn't just a technological embarrassment, it was a wake-up call. America realized that its survival might depend on the very people it had once condemned, and so von Braun and his team were given more power, more funding, and more recognition. By 1969, the image was complete. The United States had done what no nation had ever done before, landed a man on the moon. On television screens around the world, Wernher von Braun smiled beside American flags, celebrated as a hero of science. Few mentioned his past, few wanted to. History had been rewritten, not erased, but repackaged as progress. The moral cost of Operation Paperclip didn't reveal itself immediately. It lingered quietly in declassified files, in survivor testimonies, in the uncomfortable fact that the line between justice and convenience had been blurred. America had justified its choices by saying that knowledge itself was neutral, that science transcended ideology. But the truth was simpler and more haunting. When faced with extinction, nations will often trade morality for survival. Even today, the legacy of Paperclip is visible in every rocket, satellite, and spacecraft that traces its lineage back to that era. The Apollo missions, the space shuttle, even the foundations of NASA, all were built, in part, by men who had once built weapons for a dictator. Operation Paperclip is a reminder that history is never clean. It is a mosaic of contradictions, a story of how progress can rise from the most corrupted soil and how nations will sometimes choose power over purity. It forces us to ask a question that remains just as relevant now as it was then. If evil knowledge can build a better future, is it still evil?